Okay, hello. Welcome to this Constitution Unit event on reflections on over 20 years of reporting on Parliament. I'm Meg Russell, I'm the Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'm here to chair this evening's event. When the BBC's long-standing parliamentary correspondent Mark Darcy told me that he was retiring, I was ever so keen to get him here to the Constitution Unit and to have a conversation with him in one of our events. And I'm absolutely delighted that Mark has agreed to do that. As we might start off by discussing, he's had a long career at the BBC. He's been correspondent for Radio 4's Today in Parliament since 2002. He's been a presenter on other programmes like the Westminster Hour and on BBC Parliament. And worth mentioning that he was the presenter of the much missed book talk on BBC Parliament, which I was delighted to appear on, I think twice, for two of my books, on the House of Lords and on legislation at Westminster. Very sad, Mark, that is now a defunct programme, no longer broadcast. So Lisa, James and I were not able to appear on there to discuss our most recent book, The Parliamentary Battle over Brexit, which of course is in all good bookshops and came out in March this year. But we did discuss that with Mark on one of his BBC 4 programmes, BBC Radio 4 programmes. Mark has got an absolute wealth of knowledge and experience about the Westminster Parliament, having been embedded there for such a very long time, going far beyond the usual kind of who's up, who's down, and getting really sometimes into the fine minutiae of parliamentary procedure and detail in a way that us kind of parliamentary nerds absolutely love. Having been interviewed by Mark many times over the years, we could see this as a kind of payback time. I've been sat in his studio on various occasions and felt put on the spot by some of his incredibly well-informed and well-researched questions, which are sometimes quite challenging. I'm not going to deliberately inflict such stress on you, Mark, this evening, but I'm delighted that you're here, and I hope that we'll just have a nice chat about some of what you've observed over 20 years and your reflections on that. Before we move to that, let me just give a bit of housekeeping. This session will run for up to 75 minutes, and Mark and I will spend the first sort of 30 to 40 minutes having a conversation between ourselves before we then throw it out to audience questions. If you have a question you'd like to ask Mark, please write it in the Q&A function of Zoom as opposed to the chat. And Lisa James, my co-author on the parliamentary battle over Brexit, and who you can see here sat on our screen, will select a broad range of questions and ask them on your behalf. If you want your question to be asked anonymously, you can indicate that when you put it. This whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and it will be posted online afterwards on the Constitution Unit website, YouTube channel, and as a podcast after the event. So if you enjoy what you hear this evening, do look out for those recordings, and I hope you'll want to share them with others. One last bit of admin, I suppose, is to point out that despite my early attempt to get Mark here, he did actually accept another invitation shortly before this one. So I think it was on the 29th of September that Mark appeared on the UK in a Changing Europe podcast. They're, of course, good friends of ours. It's the I Tell podcast with Anand Menon hosting it. It was a very, very interesting discussion. I would very much recommend that you go and listen to it after you've listened to this one, of course. And I'm quite keen not to repeat some of the excellent conversation that went on that podcast. For those who may have already attended it, that would be boring for you. And for those of you who are able to listen to it afterwards, you can catch up on it. So I'll try and steer away from some of those questions and ask some other things. But I think, Mark, sorry, in my intro here, probably much too long, it makes sense probably to start with asking just the general thing that Anand did ask you at the beginning. If you could say a bit about your personal history, how you wound up at the BBC and what you did over that period, just to give people a bit of a flavour about your perspective before we get going on the substance.
I had a slightly unusual route into both journalism and the BBC. I left university, went into local weekly newspapers, a deeply undistinguished local weekly paper called the Putney Chronicle, where I seemed to spend a disturbing amount of my time covering the activities of then radical Tory Wandsworth Council. I then went and did a bit of politics. I was briefly the editor of the party newspaper of the now defunct SDP, ending up being purged from my evil Owenite sympathies in 1987. Well, purged is an exaggeration. I went because my face no longer fitted, because I didn't particularly like the direction that the party was going in, and just went back into journalism, and I fetched up at the Leicester Mercury. Disturbingly, this means I've known Keith Faust for 35 years. But the Mercury was a paper in a very political city with a lot of things going on in its city council and its county council, which was a hung council at the time. So it was a very good place to hone skills in political reporting, and that key reporting skill of trying to reconstruct what happened in a room you weren't in from 3 entirely different accounts of the events that unfolded there. So that was a fun place to be for quite a long time. And one of the things that struck me, and I developed a couple of political maxims in explaining particularly Leicester City Council politics to people, which I would sort of repeat when asked about them, which is the thing you've got to understand is they all hate each other and they're all mad. Now, this was at least a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but...
Did this come in handy at Westminster?
It came. It's it's the single transferable political maxim, really. It's an exaggeration and it's unfair, but it's not completely untrue. The depth of personal animosity is the great unremarked factor in a lot of political controversies, and it's animosity between individuals and between tribes, and tribes within parties as well as the political parties themselves. So that was one of the things to look out for. The other thing that continually struck me is decision avoidance. Leicestershire County Council was a hung council where the Lib Dems held the balance of power between the Conservatives and Labour, and there's a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiation, and most of the time Labour and the Lib Dems were natural allies and the Conservatives were slightly outside it. But every year they'd have a budget meeting where basically £1 billion of public expenditure would be debated, considered, voted on. And what you'd see was actually the main thrust of it all would be dispatched with a flip of a wrist, and then they'd spend 6 hours arguing about the paperclip budget. And that, again, is something that you see in Westminster when you see a budget. What you very seldom get is a really heavy, substantive debate on the budget measures in great detail. You'll get general political points, and then there'll be a big fight about some really minor point within a budget. Anyone remember the pasty tax, or the taxation of mobile homes, or some of the other issues that bedeviled budgets over the years? So those are the kind of things that you kind of got familiar with before I ever entered the precincts of Westminster. From the Leicester Mercury, I led to doing regional telly in Nottingham with East Midlands Today. And from there, I was catapulted when they abruptly abolished a whole set of regional correspondent jobs in the BBC regions. I was catapulted down to Westminster, where I did the Westminster Hour for a while, and then eventually got this job that I've just left as parliamentary correspondent, which was in 2002. Basically, I then proceeded to do the same job for 21 years and enjoyed almost every minute of it. I mean, absolutely fabulous job for someone like me, wearing my anorak of office at a ringside seat at stuff I was genuinely very interested in. And it was an absolute pleasure and delight to work in a very good team, producing a programme, Today in Parliament, day in, day out, had to produce 28 minutes. Every day Parliament was sitting on what was going on in Parliament, whether the government was tottering or it was the committee stage of the Marine and Coastal Access Bill. You were doing whatever was set in front of you and trying to make a decent programme out of it. And almost always we managed a pretty decent job because it was such a fantastic and experienced team. So the one thing I really miss about Westminster is working with that fabulous team of friends who I'm hopefully going to see for my farewell dinner in a couple of days' time.
And of course, aside from poking fun at them, is some pretty impressive politicians as well as some some quirkier ones. I want to ask you quite a number of things about sort of the enormous amount of change that we've seen over that time, and sort of some of the most interesting highlights, and some of your reflections on some of the dynamics of parliamentary politics, etc. But let me just start with one sort of further question, which goes right back to the beginning, which is, and I suppose allows a way into what you experienced over the years as well, which is when you landed at Westminster, you probably arrived with certain impressions as to what it was like, and then you gradually work there and get to know it better and better. Which of those impressions would you say, coming in as an outsider, proved to be completely wrong? What were you disabused of once you got to know the place?
I think the first thing was that I probably had a better idea, because I was reported lots of town halls and county halls and whatever's. I had a bit of a better idea of how politics work than someone who'd just come straight from something entirely different into political reporting. Simply because you spend a certain amount of time talking to politicians, you kind of absorb the vibe, if you like. What did I find most surprising about the place? I think it was probably the point I touched on slightly before, sometimes the depth of loathing that there would be between different tribes. I think you very quickly picked up the animosity between Blairites and Brownites, even in the early stage of the New Labour years. And those of us who were lurking around at the time will remember that a lot of the lid was blown off this when a journalist called Paul Routledge wrote a biography of Gordon Brown, which recounted the sort of way that he'd been checkmated out of running for leader himself by Tony Blair in, I think, when was it, 1994, when John Smith died, the Labour leader at the time, suddenly died of a heart attack. And Gordon Brown had been the heir apparent for quite a while, and Tony Blair basically slam dunked him out of the way. And there was pretty much a coronation of Tony Blair that then followed. And Gordon Brown was the designated number 2 in the partnership and was always going to be the Chancellor, and was extremely effective in that role. But clearly the seething resentment between Tony Blair's tribe and Gordon Brown's tribe, and a lot of that resentment also focused on Peter Mandelson, led to this wonderful soap opera dimension to politics. And that, I think, was one of the things that most surprised me, the extent to which politics could be reduced to almost soap opera-like collection of personal rivalries. It wasn't so much about the high political issues, because while there were probably differences of emphasis between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, they were hardly, on opposite planets, the way Jeremy Corbyn was. For example, very distant in his views from a lot of Labour MPs who he was having to lead. So that was one of the things that really surprised me, the depth of the personality thing there. I was slightly expected a bit more high-mindedness, dear innocent naive child that I was.
Anand stole what's one of the most obvious questions, which is what's been the biggest change in the period that you were based in Westminster? And I thought you gave a very interesting, and I mean, maybe it's not for me to say, but it seemed to me a very valid answer, which was about the demographic change in the House of Commons, how much more female it has become, how it's much more representative chamber than it used to be, and the effect that that's had on its culture and so on. And let's not go back to that. It's not because I don't think it's important. It's because I think people can go and listen to it on the ITEL podcast, which I plugged earlier. Can I ask you, in terms of procedures, what do you think have been some of the most important changes over that time? And it's interesting that the previous question you didn't answer procedurally. You answered in terms of sort of personalities and not specifically parliamentary politics. So you might get us a little bit more into procedure in terms of, were there weird things happening then that have since been changed, etc.?
Well, some of the more baroque things that used to happen in the Commons have now stopped. There was a time when, for reasons that pass all understanding, if an MP wished to raise a point of order during a vote, a division in common speak, you had to wear a collapsible opera hat. That kind of thing has gone. They cleared out a lot of sort of Victorian procedural detritus from the running of the Commons. Simple things like, once upon a time, the detailed committee consideration of a piece of legislation was done in a standing committee. And Jack Straw, when he was leader of the Commons, very sensibly renamed them public bill committees, because they weren't standing committees. They weren't in any way a permanent committee. They were a committee that was brought together in an ad hoc way for that particular bill. So it was just like, bits of random misleading terminology have gone. I think that the biggest thing was almost universal timetabling of bills. The idea of the Commons being self-regulating to the extent that people could kind of be trusted to use the available time without going overboard and filibustering. That to some extent went out the window, and almost every bill was timetabled. There's always a point where the second reading debate would finish, the committee stage would end, if it was committee of the whole house, where report stage would end, when third reading would happen, and those kind of things. So for journalists operationally, that made life an awful lot easier, just because you kind of knew when things were going to happen a bit more effectively. So that was a noticeable change. But the big one for me is that the select committee structure of the Commons really came of age. Now, when I arrived to cover Westminster 2002, the select committee structure was to some extent already in place. There were committees shadowing government departments. They would slightly reconfigure when the government shook up the departmental structure, but there'd be a business committee, there'd be a treasury committee, there'd be a home affairs committee shadowing the Home Office, and so on and so forth. But what happened in 2010 was that a committee which you were, of course, heavily involved in, the Wright Committee, under the great Tony Wright, Labour politics professor turned Labour MP, recommended that the chairs of select committees should be elected by the whole House. There would be a deal to set out which party got to chair which committee, but within that, the whole House then chose the MP who did it. And that created a marvellous dynamic where very often if you had, say, 3 Conservative MPs, when the Conservatives are in power, all vying to chair a particular committee, that in effect meant that if the opposition voted largely as a bloc, they got to choose the person who chaired that committee, which Conservative chaired that committee, and they'd usually opt for the most troublesome one. So that made things a lot more lively. And the select committee chairs tended to become figures with a bit more authority because they weren't the ciphers of the whips. They couldn't be removed with a flick of a wrist if they became too inconvenient. And they gradually, over the years, have just become much more naturally authoritative figures in the proceedings of Parliament. So when the likes of Meg Hillier, the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, get up to weigh in on some procurement debacle in government, they're one of the first people who get called because they're an important and informed voice. So that, I think, is quite a big deal. And it's one of the reasons why, although I think the Commons generally is not a particularly effective institution for scrutinising what ministers are doing, the select committees usually are. If the chair is any good at all, the select committee will usually be pretty good at keeping an eye on the doings of government, and that feeds into the system. And it also doesn't, sorry, I'm rambling on a bit here, but there is one other important thing here. The select committees, having become more important, have kind of incubated, if you like, the virus of cross-party working. Select committees produce groups of MPs who know each other, who work with each other, who often quite unexpectedly find out they have things in common. And that has in turn communicated itself to things like all-party groups. This is one of the things that perhaps underlies the increased emphasis that there's been in recent years on women's health issues. There was a menopause bill last year, for example. There are all kinds of debates on things like birth trauma that happen now with quite organised groups of MPs cooperating effectively well across party lines on non-party issues that probably wouldn't have got a look in even a few years before.
Yeah, it's interesting. And that actually illustrates one of the things that I always try to get across about Parliament, that it's, and as you say, I think the select committees have influenced the culture of the whole place. It's not just what you see above the waterline, as it were, in terms of the select committee reports and the hearings. It's the relationships that get formed, and the expertise that gets built up, the relationships also with external groups who are interested in what the select committee is doing, which actually goes on to inform what those members do in the rest of their parliamentary time, which is, I think, a sort of general lesson about Westminster, that there's much more to it than what you can see above the surface. There's so much more going on behind the scenes, and the culture is so important as well as the procedure. But since you've mentioned the Wright Committee, and you mentioned that I worked for it as a specialist advisor, it's interesting that you haven't mentioned the Backbench Business Committee as an important reform. We had high hopes for the Backbench Business Committee, and without being too unfair to it, I think it hasn't quite reached the level of impact that the Right Committee anticipated that it would. And I wonder whether you've got any reflections on why that happened.
The Backbench Business Committee, I think, actually had more impact when it started, possibly, than it does now. I think to some extent it's been domesticated. When it started out, it was a wholly new institution within Parliament. The Backbench Business Committee controlled a block of Commons debating time, in which it could organise debates on issues that MPs wanted to talk about that were explicitly not party issues. I mean, if Labour wanted to have a go at the government policy on something, it had opposition dates for that. And similarly, the other parties had small stocks of opposition days that they could deploy when they wanted to raise an issue. So these had to be issues explicitly with cross-party support. Now, a lot of that is owed to someone called Natasha Engel, who was the inaugural chair of the Backbench Business Committee and devoted a lot of thought to how it should operate, how it should be set up, wanted the kind of so-called Dragon's Den process where you'd go along to the Backbench Business Committee and you would, if you were a Labour MP, you'd turn up with a Conservative MP and a Lib Dem and Caroline Lucas if she wasn't doing one of the 50 million other things that Caroline Lucas usually had to do as the Parliament Sol Green, and you'd find a Scottish Nationalist, etc. And you'd turn up in a little phalanx and say, we want a debate on this issue. And we can get you 50 speakers, and we want it in chamber time in the limelight so we can really thrash this out and get an answer from the minister about what he's going to do about it. And those kind of debates generally kind of wrenched the Commons away from the party's agenda and got them to focus on other things. And so it's quite important in that sense. And the committee still does that, but somehow it all seems a lot lower key. One of the factors behind it was the first edition of the Backbench Business Committee. A lot of people just thought this was going to be some sort of weird twiddly backwater for obsessives and anoraks. But the core Brexiteers spotted its potential for mayhem. And if you look at the composition of the first Backbench Committee, it had a lot of very, very hardline Brexiteers there who were poised to use the Backbench Business Committee to get debates on the need for a referendum on Britain's EU membership, all sorts of things that were going on in the EU that they didn't like, stirring Conservative discontent. And they did it very well. I once wrote a piece which slightly annoyed the subjects, but was suggesting that, if Brexiteers wanted to put up great sort of heroic bronze statues of heroes of Brexit, they ought to include both John Bercow and Tony Wright among those who were immortalised in bronze, because actually they had provided mechanisms that hadn't existed before that these guys, and it was guys overwhelmingly, exploited very, very effectively.
And of course, Bercow, he appears in the first chapter of the book. I think it's the first chapter, our Parliamentary Battle Over Brexit book, because he facilitates that group through allowing the amendment to the Queen's speech coming from Conservative backbenchers, which was unprecedented procedurally and was one of his first kind of really controversial procedural decisions. But of course, at that time, it was in favour of the Brexiteers, and later on, he was getting a name for, being accused of too much procedural innovation that was harmful to the Brexit cause at a later point. So that's interesting.
It was a very important moment, that. And if you want an example of, Jesuitical procedural language, I can't quite remember. There is a moment when the then leader of the House, I think it was George Young off the top of my head, asked how he had been able to allow this, and he came up with a hair-splitting justification about the meaning of the words in the standing orders that had actually been supplied to him by the Clerk of the Commons, then Sir Robert Rogers. And this was actually the subject, Bercow's decision to do this was actually the subject of the famous row that led to Robert Rogers, now Lord Lisvane, basically later being able to complain about bullying by Bercow, because I think there's an absolutely grotesque row between them. But Rogers sort of almost on his way out the door handed Bercow a side of A4 with this wonderfully Jesuitical language in it. So there are all sorts of little fateful strands entwined in that decision. But the build-up to that owed a very great deal to the Backbench Business Committee. And it's still an important part of what goes on in the Commons, is getting some of these subjects onto the floor of the House that wouldn't be chosen by the parties, that aren't party political, but are fantastically important.
And in your UK and Changing Europe podcast, you're a little bit negative about some aspects of the Commons, and you're very, very positive about aspects of the Lords, and the fact that real debates go on there and people actually listen, and you have the crossbenchers, some of whom are at the top of their professions, and all of that. Our last event here was with Ian Dunt, who was talking about his book, How Westminster Works and Why It Doesn't. And his line in that book is very firmly that so much as he would see it of the House of Commons is effectively broken and worthless, but the select committees are wonderful. And then the House of Lords is wonderful. And we've had a little bit of the same from you just now when you were talking about the select committees being a high point, and also in the previous podcast talking about the Lords. I wonder whether I could tempt you into, can you see things the other way? Does the Commons have little known virtues, and are there some downsides to the Lords, perhaps particularly in the way it's developed over the last 10 years or so? Do we over-romanticize the Lords, do you think? And are we a bit unfair on the Commons sometimes?
The House of Lords can be very, very good. And sometimes you listen to the wealth. I mean, the upside of the House of Lords, if you like, is the wealth of experience that's there. You've got chiefs of the defence staff, you've got senior diplomats, you've got world-leading scientists, you've got really powerful academics, you've got experienced former ministers. Some miserable junior Foreign Office minister in the House of Lords finding themselves being questioned by 3 different foreign secretaries at a go can be quite a terrifying experience for someone who basically just through the door. So that's the upside of it. I mean, there is a tendency for it to be kind of the apotheosis of last year's conventional wisdom. It's like old jam going sugary at the edges, if you like. Sometimes sometimes they're rather congealed in the environment that they came up in. I think that's probably true of everybody in the end. But the House of Lords is a place where it can occasionally be very obvious.
Yeah, and I think some of that has always been true. I remember in my book that was published in 2013 on the Lords, I think it was Paul Tyler that I quoted as calling it a chamber not so much of experts as of ex-experts. But I suppose one of the things that preoccupies me is that book is now, it's still sort of the main book that people would need to look to understand the House of Lords. But that was 10 years ago now. I think probably quite a lot has changed. Can you, in terms of the types of people, certainly the volume of people, what changes have you noticed?
Well, for a start, a lot of much younger people are becoming peers. There's a Downing Street aide whose name completely escapes me, who I think is now in her 20s, is being put in.
Charlotte Owen, I think.
Charlotte Owen, get quite right.
30 now. But yeah.
30 now. She's just scraped past the line there. There's a whole load of much younger people who can basically expect several decades of legislating if they can be bothered to do it, and could be shaping our laws for many, many decades to come. And I'm not sure that's entirely a good thing. I do think the reputational threat to the House of Lords, it seems to me, is much more about the appointment system than the people who day in, day out are in the chamber debating the fine detail of legislation. And I'm not one of these people who believes that the next Labour government will immediately do full throttle Lords reform and create an elected Assembly of the Regions or something like that. I simply do not believe that an incoming Labour government, for example, is going to be willing to have week upon week of Committee of the Whole House and House of Commons crowding out any other legislation it can do on an issue that divides across all parties. Especially, I mean, you will remember Robin Cook's attempt to get indicative Lords reform votes through. And the House of Commons couldn't in the end find a majority for any option for having an elected element in the House of Lords. It's rather foreshadowed the later, even more notorious attempt to find an option for the shape of Brexit, where the House of Commons rejected all its indicative votes there. So it's an incredibly divisive, very techy issue, and there are no votes in it. I think almost nobody in the wider electorate, I think almost all the people whose votes might be swung in a general election by the shapers on the pattern of Lords reform are probably watching this podcast. It is not an issue that drives the vast number of voters. That's not to say it's unimportant, but you just cannot get voter excitement around it. So I think the House of Lords is probably going to have some of the rougher corners knocked off. Maybe the appointment system gets beefed up, and maybe an incoming Prime Minister accepts that the House of Lords Appointments Commission should have some kind of veto on people who shouldn't be appointed to it. Maybe there'll be term limits, and after you've been there for 30 years, you have to go. Maybe there will be an end to the ludicrous hereditary by-elections where there are often more candidates than there are voters electing a Liberal Democrat peer to the House of Lords, for example. So maybe those things will happen, but the idea that some sort of completely new body on a completely elected footing is going to be put in there is for the birds, as John Berger would say. Sorry, I've lost the thread of your original question.
Which was whether we should perhaps be a little bit more positive about the Commons and a little bit more sceptical about the Lords, rather than holding one on a pedestal and being constantly critical of the other.
I don't want to be overly critical of the House of Commons, and in particular, I don't want to be overly critical of its inmates. I think the problem for a lot of MPs is that they are trapped within a deeply dysfunctional system, where they have actually startlingly little direct power. The key constraint on what a government puts through is what it thinks it can get past the House of Commons. So they're never going to put in a sort of the slaughter of the firstborn bill. If they don't think that the troops are going to vote for it, or indeed if they think that it's going to be so divisive that a large chunk of the party splits off and that does lasting damage later.
Which is a really important point, I think, because just by virtue of being there, those people are influencing policy, but they might not feel that they're influencing it because it's the policy that never sees the light of day, which is one of the reasons why people think the place is kind of a rubber stamp. Because actually the stuff, we've had some instances in recent years of different things, because I think there have been some problems with party management. But basically the rule is, if it's not going to get through the House of Commons, don't bother introducing it.
Yeah, well, except that occasionally governments find that they have to. When Tony Blair decided to go for the Iraq War, he knew he was going to split his party dramatically. And the vote on the Iraq, I was in the commentary box. Basically there in case of militant anti-war activists abseiled into the chamber. But the BBC was otherwise basically was holding its discussions and interviews outside and was just keeping an eye on what was going on in the Commons during that debate. But that was absolutely clearly going to cause lasting damage to Labour Party unity, and indeed it did. And the kind of the splits and fissures that led to persisted for a very, very long time afterwards. And again, when you got to Brexit, they had to bring that issue then. They knew it was going to split their party. Theresa May had an absolute nightmare trying to get her various Brexit positions through the House of Commons and failing. And Boris Johnson ended up resorting to really extreme tactics of removing the whip from Conservative MPs, including such luminaries as Ken Clarke. So, sometimes governments are forced to do stuff that they know is going to be incredibly divisive. But as you say, most of the time, they will shy away from doing that simply because they want to keep the show on the road.
Yeah. Let me just have a quick intermission to remind people in the audience that they can submit questions for Mark. I can see we've got a few coming in, but I had a sneaky look in a minute ago and I see that Mark has inadvertently answered some of the questions already. So we've definitely got room for more. I know that if you ask your question now, you worry that it will get discussed before we get to the questions, but you can submit another one. So keep the questions coming. We'll keep talking for a little bit longer, and then we can pass over to Lisa and bring in some of the audience points. You got there to one of the points that I was going to raise, Mark, about whipping, about the relationship between political leaders and their backbenchers and how that has changed over this period. And I don't know whether you feel that there is any sort of particular direction of change. Does it just ping around according to the circumstances? Or is there any sort of definite move? I mean, we had at the beginning quite tight discipline under Blair. Then you've been through Blair, you've been through Brown. Then we had the coalition, and then Cameron, and then May, and then ultimately Johnson. In that period, we see a person elected to the leadership of the Labour Party who was the most rebellious Labour MP through the Blair and Brown years, which was pretty remarkable. So the sort of the victory of the rebels on that side, and by the end we're getting to Ken Clarke being thrown out by Boris Johnson. So a bit of a sense of what's been going on there, perhaps. How's it look to you?
I think a lot of the most extreme whipping happens when the circumstances are at their most extreme. I mean, some years ago, I interviewed the late great Walter Harrison, who was Jim Callaghan's deputy chief whip in the late 1970s when the Labour government was in a minority, and where they basically survived on a hand-to-mouth, day-to-day basis by roping in the votes of the almost individual members of the smaller parties. Can you peel off a couple of Scottish nationalists here or a Northern Ireland unionist there? And he had this fantastic story about being drunk under the table by an Irish Republican MP called Frank Maguire, who would occasionally come over to Westminster. And the Labour whips kept him happy by putting a bottle of Bushmills on the table. And he would sit there and drink a succession of them under the table and then totter off and vote in the appointed way. He's also the only person, I think, who ever registered half a vote in a Commons committee by sticking his leg through a door just as a committee division was taking place and managing to get in, and the Speaker actually had to make a ruling on it. So all sorts of really sort of high whipping tricks. And he was a real tough guy. I mean, this is a guy who had been in the 50s and 60s. A shop steward for, I think, the Electricians Union. And he was a real tough guy. President Nixon's advisor, Chuck Colson, used to have a dictum that when you've got them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. Walter Harrison practiced this literally. And if you don't believe me, look him up in the index to Jack Straw's memoirs, because Jack Straw was thinking of voting against the government on something, and Deputy Chief Whip Harrison literally grabbed him by the testicles, gave him a good twist, and ensured that he adhered to party discipline. So, those were the days. Things are not like that now in quite the same way, but the whips can be very tough and the punishments can be considerable. Sir Peter Soulsby, who's the current mayor of Leicester, and who was a Labour MP in, I think, 2005 to 2010 sort of era, once complained to me that he had been put on the select committee looking at the Crossrail bill, the rail tunnel through the centre of London, and that was he felt a gulag to which he'd been consigned as a punishment for voting against some Iraq war-related vote. The whips have ways of using party discipline to bring people under control, but the more extreme the circumstances, the harder they will squeeze. And sometimes the harder they squeeze, the angrier their victims become. I mean, this certainly happened with a lot of Conservative Brexiteers. It certainly happened to us in the Jeremy Corbyn era. And it certainly happened in the Brexit era, when, as you said, quite a lot of really stellar Conservative names suddenly found themselves on the rough end of party discipline that they'd normally apply to other people. I mean, there's a minor point here about how the old Conservative establishment at which those people had been passed suddenly found themselves having to try and be insurgents, while the old Conservative insurgency that the Brexiteers had been suddenly found themselves basically as the government, and neither has completely mastered the opposite set of art. So, the former establishment hasn't really become an effective guerrilla force even now. And you might very well think that a lot of those Conservative backbenchers who made David Cameron and Theresa May's life hell haven't necessarily quite got government yet.
And I think it was it's unsurprising, but it was a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of Boris Johnson, who I think thought that Parliament was something like, many other things, was just something you trampled over. You were in charge, you told it what to do. And of course, if you do that one time too many, it jumps up and bites you. And ultimately it's in charge, it turns out, and it can remove you. It wasn't easy. It spent some time for them to get angry enough to get rid of him, and it wasn't easy. But actually, they're the ones in charge in the end.
Well, this is ultimately the last three prime ministers have fallen because they lost the confidence of their troops.
Yeah.
With Theresa May, Boris Johnson, and even on the back of his spectacular election victory in 2019, which carried him quite a long way. With Theresa May, with Boris Johnson, and then very, very quickly with Liz Truss. there was a breakdown in parliamentary confidence and parliamentary discipline. And the point in the middle of last year, when there seemed to be sort of revolving doors in most government departments with ministers going in and out at a dizzying rate, we completely lost track of who was a minister and who was a rebel, and who had been reinstated and who had sold out and who had ratted and who had re-ratted. The most extraordinary cavalcade of chaos that went on then. But it was partly because this loss of control and this sense of empowerment that you get when the parliamentary numbers are really tight. The smart performers will realise you've got leverage when the numbers are tight and you can get stuff. I used to have a little quip that when Theresa May was in trouble during the Brexit years and depended for her majority in the Ulster Democratic Unionist Party, every time there was a tight vote in the Commons, another small town in Northern Ireland got a bypass. And you could occasionally run across them gloating over their latest success in leveraging some goodies for Northern Ireland. And you've got to take, I'm not blaming them for that, you've got to take your opportunities where you can to get stuff for your constituents. And they did, in spades.
We've got loads of good questions coming in now. I just want to ask you one more thing, because I'm not sure it's going to come up in the questions. But yeah, we've got a very good audience here and some really interesting questions. So I'll pass to Lisa in just a moment. But let me ask you one more thing, which is more about your trade to an extent, I suppose, which is that over that period, there have also been phenomenal changes in the media.
Okay.
No, I mean, we have moved to 24-hour news media over that time, which wasn't around probably at the beginning of the period. And then obviously the growth of social media, meaning that MPs themselves, as well as committees and everybody else, has got a direct mode of transmission and engagement with people outside Parliament, which I think slightly affects whipping, but affects the dynamics in general. How do you think changes in the media environment have changed Westminster and the way that we understand Westminster?
I think there's a lot there. I mean, when I sat in the Commons press gallery on some big occasion, usually Prime Minister's questions. Incidentally, one of the reasons I eventually decided to retire was that every time I went to Prime Minister's questions, I felt a little bit of my soul shriveled. Because it's just become such an awful empty ritual. But you'd sit there, you'd look down, and the chamber's actually not all that brightly lit. And you can see all these glowing screens, and you realise that all the people in the chamber, dozens of them are live tweeting proceedings and firing off comments. And so that not only is there the formal debate or exchanges of questions and answers taking place in the chamber, there's a kind of Greek chorus of MPs sounding off online. And beyond that, there's an even bigger Greek chorus of the wider world commenting on what they see and hear. And if you're a journalist and you say something, there's a Greek chorus commenting on what you've said. I mean, I came spectacularly unstuck a few years ago when Jeremy Corbyn was having a go at the Home Secretary at the time. I can't even remember who it was. Probably might have been Priti Patel, but I forget. No, it wasn't. It was Amber Rudd. Amber Rudd, there was some sort of immigration fiasco, as there usually is these days. And he called for her to resign. And I wrote on the BBC website that this looks a bit like overreach. And then a couple of days later, Amber Rudd did resign. Now, I might rationalise this by saying that I think the real author of her downfall was not Jeremy Corbyn calling for her to go, but Yvette Cooper, then chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, very effectively making a fool of her. But whatever, I was basically then underwent like a 5-day bombardment by various sort of Corbynista media outlets, basically accusing me of being a CIA agent or something. And it just went on and on. It was extraordinarily unpleasant. I took a very early decision not to engage with it because I just simply didn't see the point. I wasn't going to change anybody's mind. So, and eventually it just blew itself out. But bigger people than me have a much more unpleasant time. I mean, Laura Kunsberg notoriously was cyberbullied constantly from almost all sides, to the point where she actually needed a bodyguard attending party conferences. And these things are really very unpleasant, and they do affect journalists. And they do, of course, MPs are on the receiving end of probably much worse treatment than that a lot of the time. And I do not believe it is completely unconnected that a couple of MPs have been murdered on my watch. And I still remember, one of the nastiest, most sort of soul-shattering moments I remember was the 2016 murder of Joe Cox, which was just awful. I was the journalist on duty that day, sort of supernumerary in the run-up to the referendum on the news desk, and I was told to phone up and make some calls because something appeared to have happened to her and we didn't know what. and I had just about managed to establish what had happened when I was hopefully about to be first with the facts on trying to reveal what had been going on, and the fire alarm went off and the BBC newsroom had to be cleared. But it was a really, really horrible incident, and I think that a lot of that comes down to the poison that floats around in politics and is intensified by social media, and that changes the way everybody behaves and thinks in the wider political community, MPs and plenty of other people beyond that.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go over to the audience questions. I'll come back right at the end and ask you a couple of things about your future plans and things, Mark, but let's get the audience in and we can come back and have a little teeny conversation right at the end. There's some great questions. Lisa, what have you picked out?
Okay, I thought we'd start with a bit of a quick fire round for Mark. So first of all, and I'll pose a few of these. Paul Evans asks, what book should a literate Martian read to understand the House of Commons, and what film or play should they watch? You're welcome to jump in, or I'll post some more.
I can jump in on that one. Watch This House, James Graham's wonderful play about the latter years. I was talking about Walter Harrison earlier, about the latter years of Labour in the 70s. It is a quite wonderful play, which captures quite a lot, I think. I mean, how accurate it is, only the players can say, but it was one of the most engrossing political dramas I've ever seen.
Timothy Haslam, who was the most interesting politician to interview and why?
It depends what you want to get out of them. I mean, there are some people with really in-depth knowledge. I mean, I tended to talk to the sort of procedural people a bit. The people I admired, most admire in the House of Commons, are the ones who are not only believe in something, and there are plenty of people who don't appear to believe functionally in anything, but not only believe in something, but have the street smarts to go and make the argument for it, which is why I got on very well with a lot of Conservative Brexiteers, because I think that they were fighting very hard for a political goal that they wanted, while their party establishment basically seemed to think that if they were blackballed from enough clubs, they'd just go away. And it turned out not to be the case. So, I got on very well with a number of people like Steve Baker, for example, who's a very interesting guy with good knowledge of how the system worked and an almost mystic ability to herd the 100 tribes of Tory Brexiteer in roughly the same direction, at least for a while. So, someone like him, talking about that, Stella Creasy arguing for dealing with violence against women, Alistair Carmichael, a sort of rather wily Lib Dem who was Deputy Chief Whip during the coalition, is someone who just has a really good functional understanding of how to get stuff out of the common system. So there's a whole load of people like that I would talk to about this. And it's a slightly niche thing, because I'm not necessarily going for some grand Secretary of State for sweeping high policy, but I'm looking at how if you like, the parliamentary sausage machine is cracked.
And one last quick fire one then from Paul Regan. What was the most memorable parliamentary moment of your career?
I mean, quite a lot. I was, as I say, in the chamber press box, which is kind of behind the entrance that leads out towards Central Lobby. There's a little box with an absolutely appalling view. I was in that for for several notable events. Tony Blair on the Iraq invasion. I was also there when I think were the pro-hunting protesters threw purple dust Tony Blair he was at the dispatch box doing Prime Minister's questions, and I had a producer screaming out, "What's happening? What's happening? We can't see anything." And I couldn't see anything either, because the view was almost completely blocked by MPs standing in front of the window, so I couldn't see a thing. But those were highly memorable moments. But I mean, sometimes there are moments that just catch your heartstrings. I think it was 2005 general election. A Lib Dem MP called Patsy Calton was elected to, I think, Cheadle. And during the campaign, she had discovered she had terminal cancer. And she came into the chamber in a wheelchair. And she came up to the Speaker's chair and she took the Speaker's hand. And she was doing this a lot later than new MPs do normally. And you could see the entire House's breath catch You could feel this. Yeah, they all knew what was going on. Speaker Martin came down off his chair and took her hand and congratulated her, and she sort of went past out of the entrance behind the Speaker's chair. But that was a very, very emotional moment where, just the human moment of that overtook anything else that was going on. And, it is quite rare for there to be a warm hear directed at a Liberal Democrat by a Holster collective of the House of Commons. But this was. It was quite a moving moment. I mean, that's a very niche emotional thing. I imagine the question is looking for some sort of great moment of high political drama. And if I wanted to nominate that, I think it would be the moment that the House of Commons voted not to allow the UK to participate in the bombing of Syria, 2013, so 10 years ago this year, in an incredibly charged debate. And that was, I think, almost the House of Commons revisiting its failure to stop the Iraq War, or at least British participation in the Iraq War. And that was a moment that has quite a constitutional knock-on, because I think that created a sort of de facto war powers position where prime ministers now don't feel that they can participate in those kind of conflicts without the authorization of the Commons.
And you've touched on culture a few times, both in this conversation and when talking to UK and changing Europe. And I have a question that follows on from that from Andrew, who says, both houses have put much energy lately into culture change, diversity and inclusion, behaviour and respect. Have you felt the difference? And another, which may be similar, may be different from a different answer from John, there's likely to be a major turnover of MPs at the next election. Right. Do you think the newcomers will treat the job differently to the way their predecessors have?
To take that last one first, I think each generation treats the job differently. It is far harder now, for example, for an MP to be blasé about constituency responsibilities. If you read back sort of political memoirs from a couple of generations ago, people like Roy Jenkins would basically make a sort of bi-monthly state visit to their constituency and would do a couple of surgeries and be photographed shaking hands with a few people or opening a fete or something, and then would disappear again. And that was, to some extent, how it was done. Nowadays, I think there are very few MPs who can't afford to be all over their constituency all the time. And that's not just the ones with, sort of majorities under 5,000. I mean, you look at some of the recent by-elections that, that really put the fear of God into practically everybody. And if you look at the turnover that have occurred in recent elections, the complete wipeout of the Scottish Labour Party in 2015, for example, imposing majorities 10, 20, 30,000, gone. The complete demise of the Liberal Democrats in 2015, where they went from having 50-ish MPs down to, what was it, 11 or 12, gone. And you look at what happened to the Red Wall Labour MPs in 2019, where a whole load of seats were just swept away that had been Labour forever. I mean, Bolsover, for heaven's sake, Dennis Skinner losing a seat that he'd held since 1970, a traditional mining seat, gone. So nobody thinks that just counting the majorities anymore is a guarantee that you will survive. There's a feeling that there can be these tides that can just wash you away. And your constituency work might be the thing that saves you by 10 or 20 votes. And so a lot more MPs are a lot more assiduous. So there's that side of it. There are MPs who are very active on social media, sometimes unproductively. There's a fantastically entertaining spat going on Twitter today between Nadine Dorries and a Conservative MP called, I think, Paul Holmes, in which they are fighting over the rights and wrongs of the by-election in her seat in ways that I imagine are causing party managers to wince, but it's all great fun. And if you get a chance to track it down on Twitter, it's a good laugh. But there are MPs there who are sometimes quite counterproductively active on social media. There are MPs who, I think, almost see themselves as cross-party campaigners, and there are MPs who see themselves as local representatives pretty much above all else. They may wear a red or a blue or an orange rosette, but their prime focus is their seat. So those are the kind of changes that I've noticed. That some of these subcategories are a bit more obvious than they used to be. I don't know if that's any kind of answer to the question. I apologise, I just went on a ramble.
Quite all right. I think it leads into the next thing that I wanted to pose to you, which is from Keith Rafferty. You've obviously seen some major constitutional changes take place during the time that you've been working in Westminster, among them the establishment of the Scottish Parliament and the Senate. How do you think Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem MPs have responded or reacted to having counterparts in Holyrood and Cardiff Bay? What changes have you seen that cause at Westminster?
It does cause a certain difficulty, where you have, Scottish questions and someone asks about the health service or education, which are devolved responsibilities, or similarly in Wales. So, there's a slight, you've got some government minister answering, yes, this is all terribly important, but what can I do about it? You've got to go and have a word with the relevant First Minister. They don't quite say that, but that's the implication of it. And then you have the flip side of that, which of course we don't have devolution at the moment in Northern Ireland, and that is an issue that causes endless problems, not least that every now and then Westminster has to publish a spending bill for Northern Ireland to authorise the budgets for agencies that are sort of ticking over there, while fundamental issues and the running of the health service and education in Northern Ireland are left unaddressed, because Westminster doesn't want to touch them and hopes that eventually the Northern Ireland Assembly will be back up and running and deal with them, even though there doesn't seem to be any reasonable prospect of that happening anytime soon. So that's where the devolution settlement exists. It is not operating, but Westminster still doesn't want to get its fingers on it.
And let's pick up, I think, an interesting question that's been posed by an anonymous attendee about the vexed topic of R&R, restoration and renewal. What's your view on the argument about relocation of the Commons and Lords? All these debates about whether maintenance and refurbishment costs are too high to justify staying, moving, etc. Do you think this argument is going to be resolved?
I can remember a debate shortly after Brexit in which some Conservative MP, I think it was Edward Lee, said, "We can't leave this mother of Parliament." Now, one of the questions you get asked on interviews for Today in Parliament is, what's the origin of the phrase mother of Parliament? What was the mother? England is the mother of Parliament. Someone's poetry or other says that. And so Westminster is not the mother of Parliament, but leaving that aside, we can't leave the mother of Parliament. What sort of a symbol would it be of Brexit Britain if we were to do that and we were to abandon this historic chamber, etc., etc.? I kind of think that it might be rather near the knuckle as a symbol of Brexit Britain if the world famous, one of the 2 or 3 most recognisable buildings on the planet actually burnt down, probably on live global television, rather like Notre Dame did. And there are serious people who think that is a serious issue. There are, the clerk of the House has said, well, I think it's the last one now, I think John Benjer has just been replaced, but the clerk of the House has said that he would have qualms about ordering staff to continue to work in the building while it was being refurbished, because there'd be so much asbestos in the atmosphere. The idea that it is possible to keep large chunks of a building full of uncharted voids open while asbestos was removed from it and total rewiring took place. I mean, unless MPs are going to march into the Chamber of the Commons through some kind of pressurised plastic tunnel while pumps maintain positive air pressure so that the entire political class isn't wiped out by asbestosis. It is a nitwit idea. It is crazy. It is also vastly more expensive to attempt to refurbish Parliament around sitting MPs and peers and thousands of staff. You're talking, many multiples of hundreds of millions of pounds more. Just keeping the place open at the moment requires fire patrols, which regularly find small fires that they then put out, incidentally. The possibility that the place could go up in flames or become a giant metaphor and be flooded in its own sewage, which is a distinct possibility given the state of the pipework, or that one day there'll be a state opening, there's going to be one in a couple of weeks' time, and the lights go fuck because some fuse has gone and King Charles is marooned in pitch darkness on the throne. All those things could happen. The state of the building is awful because governments have constantly bottled the idea of spending the necessary billions of pounds to restore it. It's a World Heritage building occupying a space of a city block in American terms. It is an absolutely vast undertaking to do it. And it all has to be done to a decent standard. You're not talking about an industrial unit outside in Slough here. You're talking about an elaborately carved World Heritage building in a World Heritage site. So one way or another, Britain kind of has to get on with this. But at the same time, you're talking about an incoming government not having two filings to rub together. So you can understand why they don't want to bite this particular bullet, and you can absolutely see how ministers wince at the thought of how the public would resent it being done. But I don't think the public would be desperately keen on seeing the place burned down either. There may be some who would, but it seems to me absolutely crazy to therefore go for the option that actually in the long run costs a great deal more, but doesn't involve a great watch of billions being spent in 1 year, which is basically where the government is now. Anyone who's familiar with the place knows that behind the sort of Victorian splendours of it all, the stonework is crumbling, the window frames are leaking, the electricity, you can hear, Meg Hillier, the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, I frequently interviewed in her office, and occasionally you can hear the crackling sounds, ominous crackling sounds coming from the plugs. You look carefully in some of these corridors, you can see mice scuttling about. The place is in a terrible state. And it could fail catastrophically. And that would be, I think, a national embarrassment of colossal proportions. Sorry, rant over. I'll have a glass of water.
Now, I'm conscious I need to hand back to Meg before we wrap up, but I have a couple more rounds of what I think are really interesting questions about public opinion and about the role of the media. So let's start with public opinion. So James Cleaver, formerly of the unit, says democracy rests on public opinion, and MPs have easy access to representative or unrepresentative snapshots on social media, in the press. But we probably don't want government policy change in response to every online trend or every newspaper headline. So what does a healthy relationship between MPs and public opinion look like? And I'll tag on to that a question from Christina Leston-Bandera, who asked specifically about the new petitioning system that was introduced in 2015. What impact do you think that's had? Has it brought new voices into Parliament, or has it just added more noise?
Well, to take that second one first, I think the petitioning system is becoming increasingly important and increasingly successful. Little known fact, after Prime Minister's Question Time, the most viewed debates on the parliamentary website, parliament.tv.uk, well, I'm garbling it, but if you go to the official parliamentary video feed, the most viewed debates are petitions debates. Now, a lot of that is because they're frequently sort of hashtag-driven social media campaigns, and if you've signed a petition, you get an email saying we want to watch this, and off you go. But they are viewed, and they bring in issues that people care about, and they thrash out stuff that perhaps wouldn't otherwise be brought within the parliamentary system. So I think the Petitions Committee is one of the successes of recent procedural changes, simply because the public can see MPs talking about stuff. They don't necessarily directly change things, but they do give MPs a chance to talk about stuff that the public has raised, and that does feed into the wider process. A minister has to give a view at the end of these debates, so that is of itself quite important. The wider question of the relationship between, you can't run a country according to real-time polling, not least because the public has an unfortunate habit of changing its mind. But knowing where the general public is and having an understanding of what your voters want is part of a democracy. You may not want to give your voters what they want, but you need to understand what it is that they want. And maybe then perhaps explain to them why you think it would be bad for them to get what they wanted. But the leadership entails a bit more. Once you do the famous cliche of "I'm the leader, I must follow them," you're lost. Politicians have to be for something. They have to have a framework of ideas about how they think the country should be run. That framework gets tested in action, and then the public gets to give its verdicts at elections. That's the system. If you are diverted every time the opinion poll rating drops a couple of points, you are lost. So I kind of think trust the process and trust your own ideas, and change course when you feel you have to, by all means, but don't just feel that your job is basically to govern by clapometer.
Okay, great. And we'll finish up with some questions on the media itself. Tom McNally asks, do you think we're seeing a retreat by broadcasters and journalists from education and explanation in favour of opinion? Is that something we should be concerned about? Andrew, what could Parliament do to make your successor's life easier? And one anonymous question for anyone who wants to follow in your footsteps. What advice would you give an aspiring BBC reporter?
Oh, Lord. I'll have to think about that last one for a moment. Hello, Tom. I'm very worried by, for example, the mooted cuts on Newsnight. I think heavyweight reporting and analysis. I mean, my first job, I don't think I mentioned it in the micro CV I gave at the beginning of this program. I was the last researcher ever hired by Weekend World. People may not remember Weekend World now, but it used to be a program which featured hour-long interviews between its presenters and, you know, prime ministers, cabinet ministers, leader of the opposition, big major figures who would be quizzed in enormous detail about policy issues. And yeah, I remember sitting in on some of the preliminary work for what are we going to ask this person. My first one was with Neil Kinnock as leader of the opposition. How was he going to crush the Bennites when Tony Benn had just launched a leadership challenge? And he went through a very elaborate kind of tree of if he says this, you ask that. And if he says that, you come at him with this fact. One of my jobs during that program was to sit between Peter Mandelson, who had just become, who had been a Weekend World producer and knew exactly how these things worked, and was sitting in the gallery. And my job was to sit between him and the controls that would enable him to listen to the producer going, "Go for the throat, you've got him," and make sure that he didn't actually manage to listen to those. But that's an aside. But that's almost a lost art form now. You don't get huge, big sit-down interviews in anything like the same quantity. And it's a pity, because I think they do genuinely inform the press pack, if not, and those members of the public who wish to watch. I mean, the problem with Weekend World was it was a massively expensive program to make, and the viewing figures were minuscule because it was pretty high fibre viewing for 1 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. So those were that is what drives, I think, the feeling that political coverage needs to be made more economical. But I don't honestly see the point in turning Newsnight into yet another programme where 2 or 3 politicians sit around a table spouting the party line at one another. There are plenty of those already. I would much rather have serious analysis followed by an interview. This is the problem, Prime Minister or Cabinet Minister. What are you going to do about it? And then quiz them in detail about what their options are and what their thinking is. Because democracies need that. And it may not be for people with short attention spans. And I think increasingly so much news coverage is geared to people with the attention span of a gnat. But I think it would be a tremendous pity to lose that strand of broadcasting. And it's public service broadcasting. It shouldn't be judged purely on audience figures, even if it is massively expensive and even if budgets are constrained. And so I mourn with Tom the decline of these things. It's happening across all channels, and the BBC has horrible financial choices ahead of it. I have enormous sympathy with the managers who face them, but it's happening all over the place. And I think our democracy is the poorer for it. Remind me of some of the other questions. Sorry.
That's quite right. So the others, what could the Commons do to make your successor's life easier? And your advice for aspiring BBC reporters?
The Commons is an awful lot more accessible than it used to be. And, once upon a time, I think the institution was actually sort of quite pompous about how it regarded itself, but they've come to allow more media access. And they've come to understand that, just because we want to have pictures of something, it doesn't mean that we're going to use them in some weird fashion to traduce or discredit the institution. We just, the voters just want to see it at work. So it's become a lot better at that. I'm not sure I can think of an immediate way, other than just making its procedures a little bit more understandable. I've never managed to fathom exactly how report stage in the Commons works, and one of the really intricate parts of debating the detail of a bill. And I've had numerous people sit me down and try and explain it in words of one syllable, but I don't get it after 20 years of watching the Commons. So I imagine that anybody who was watching the Commons would find it quite difficult to fathom as well. But having a camera pointing at Parliament as it does what it does is again quite a helpful part of democracy, even if people don't fully understand the procedures. I think it's one of the more damaging parts of Commons procedure is the sort of jovial talking out of bells in private members' Fridays, where causes that people perhaps care about quite a lot are almost treated in a sort of jocular manner as MPs make long rambling speeches just to use up the time. So those kind of things I think do annoy the viewers, but that's at the moment that's the way the game's played and people are playing it within the rules. What advice would I give to an aspiring BBC journalist? Get in there. The BBC remains a fantastic place to work. I've loved working for it almost invariably. I've loved being able to report Parliament. BBC devotes more resources to reporting Parliament than pretty much anything else on the planet. We're there, rain or shine, reporting the daily proceedings of Parliament on Today in Parliament, whether, as I say, the government is falling or it's some incredibly intricate, rather humdrum committee stage debate on the floor of the whole House. There is fun to be had there for someone who's interested in this. I've liked political reporting a lot. One of the things that struck me is that a lot of the really experienced political reporters that you meet are much more about reporting the high politics of who's up and who's down in the cabinet or what's going to happen in the next political manoeuvre somewhere. But are actually startlingly uninformed about how the parliamentary system works. And maybe that's because the parliamentary system's become a less important component of our politics in day-to-day reporting, at least. But one of my suggestions is that the key thing you can do is just read the rule book, understand it a bit.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I said I wanted to ask something towards the end. And let me do that, but it can be very, very quick. I just want to ask Mark, what are you doing next? I hope this isn't the last we're going to be hearing from you. We might even get to hear some more Mark Darcy opinions as they develop and are allowed to blossom post BBC. So tell us what's coming up.
As luck would have it, the Hansard Society, a parliamentary think tank, as we say in shorthand, is launching a podcast, and I'm going to be co-presenting it with Dr. Ruth Fox of the Hansard Society. It's going to be called Parliament Matters, and it's going to be specifically focused on parliamentary politics and the workings of Parliament rather than capital P politics, the distinction I was just making, really. And my suggestion for what to call it was originally laws and sausages. But Bismarck's famous remark, the two things people should never see being made. But Parliament Matters is a pretty good title for it. It will look at things like cutting edge research. It'll look at moments in history. It'll look at what's going on. Why does this happen? How does that happen? Why is it that the Prime Minister, for example, can basically cancel HS2 or the latest one stage of HS2 with a wave of a hand when it's been authorised by the Boris put together parliamentary bill? So those kinds of questions will be meat and drink to Parliament Matters, and we're planning to launch at around the time of the state opening. So watch wherever you get your podcasts for. Get ready to download, turn on, tune in, drop out.
Brilliant. I saw Ruth last week and she gave me a tip off that this was coming, and my first instinct was I'm very jealous. The Hansard Society we see very much as a sort of sister organisation, a partner organisation. So I'm delighted for Ruth, and I'm also delighted for the rest of us that we're those of us who are worried about not hearing you talking to us about Parliament anymore can breathe a huge sigh of relief and look forward to listening to that. And if we can, when we put up the recording, maybe we can put in a link to it, because we're very keen to hear that succeed and to hear you on it. We're right up against time now, so just let me give enormous thanks to Mark, obviously for the time that you've given this evening, for everything you've done in that fantastic career that you described to us, for everything that you've taught us about Parliament, and all of the airtime that you've given some of us on Parliament to talk about our own work. Thank you so much to Lisa for fielding the questions. Thank you to all of you for coming, and particularly to those of you who submitted such interesting questions. And sorry if we didn't get to all of them, as ever, there are always too many. Thank you to those who organised behind the scenes, particularly Ed Rowe and others in the Constitution Unit team. I would say to those of you listening that if you're not already signed up to the unit's events mailing list, and indeed our podcast, I would encourage you to do so. to be the first to hear about what's coming up next in our event series, just go to our website and select subscribe or get involved. But I can now tell you what our next event is, because that is already up on our podcast. And indeed, I'm going to, I hope, put it in the chat right now for those of you who want to register. It takes place at lunchtime on the 27th of November. It's entitled The Future of Democracy in the UK, Public Attitudes and Policy Options. And it's a rather special event because it's going to be launching the final report of our Democracy in the UK After Brexit project, which has done some large surveys and a citizens' assembly looking at all sorts of aspects of people's attitude towards democracy. And the speakers will include our own Professor Alan Rennick, who's the leader on that project and Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, with a great lineup of respondents. We've got Wendy Chamberlain MP, who's the Liberal Democrat Chief Whip in the House of Commons. We've got Damien Green MP, former First Secretary of State and Chair of the One Nation Conservatives, and Nick Thomas-Symonds MP, who's Labour's Shadow Cabinet Office Minister with responsibility for all things constitutional, as well as Professor Maria Sobolewska, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester and an expert in public opinion. So that's a rather long plug for our next event on the 27th of November. Quickly go into the chat if you're interested in clicking through and registering. And if you want to register for future events, then do subscribe on our website. But for now, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to our speaker and all of the organisers, and we look forward to seeing you at another of our events very soon, I hope. Bye-bye.